This presentation focuses on threshold as cultural concretization of the intimate in domestic architecture. In a time where public and private are blurring, where professional and personal spaces are superimposed, the expressions of domestic intimacy tend to diminish at the risk of being erased in favor of an architecture indifferent to socialization's nuances. In this context, the figure of threshold, as an emblematic dispositive of the home, guardian of the boundaries of intimacy, presents itself as a privileged object, witness to values and mode of sociality, and a heritage whose memory must be preserved. We'll begin by exploring the theme of threshold as a spatial dispositive at the service of social modes in the home. Foucault initially defines the meaning and methodological function of spatial dispositive as the said as well as the unsaid. The dispositive itself, he writes, is the network that can be established between these elements. For the purpose of this study, we draw more specifically on geographer Estebanez's definition of the concept, a system that makes power and norm concrete, effective, and discrete by materially inscribing them in a specific place. The theme of threshold is part of the problem in setting spatial limits that regulate human relations at micro-sociological level by informing the appropriate behavioral syntax to adopt. The archetypal threshold is integrated into the building envelope's architectural boundary, which separates the territories outside from inside the house. According to Pierre Boudon, the threshold is part of a boundary defined as a space-place closed limit, significant as a fundamental cut segregating an interior from an exterior region. In this context, the notion of frontier has both topological and value system implications. For Hermann Hertzberger, the threshold as concretization of the in-between provides the key to the transition and connection between areas with divergent territorial claims. As he writes, as a place in its own right, it constitutes essentially the spatial condition for the meeting and dialogue between areas of different order. On the one hand, the history shows that thresholds act as mechanism of communication or implicit control, regulating the movement and behavior of visitors. At the same time, they encourage the inhabitants to take control of domestic space, this privileged place of intimate. We now turn our attention to a particular social connotation, the intimate. In Western culture, the notion of intimate is a fundamental component of the sense of home. For today's purpose, the character of the intimate is defined by considering the way people are engaged in social process inherent to dwelling. First, in the relation of the inhabitant to the self. Second, in relation with others. And then in the relation between the inhabitant and the architectural space becoming his own reflection. Rybczynski illustrated this idea with the notion of stimmung, the engraving of the cell of Saint-Jérôme, in which light, materiality, volume of the places, as well as object, express the character of the one who lives in it. Our definition of the intimate in domestic architecture is based on Levinas' thought on the social foundation of the home. Levinas explains that the notion of interiority as applied to the home refers first and foremost to the inhabitant's relationship with himself as the possibility of withdrawing into oneself. By extension, interiority refers to the part of the world occupied by a person's dwelling. This extension of the inhabitant's self to his space suggests that interiority designates both an interior life outside the world and a space where this life can take place, the home. For Levinas, the phenomenon of interiority in the home is inseparable from its counterpart, exteriority. It covers the world as a social environment outside the in itself, It corresponds to the world outside the person, to the figure of the other, and to his otherness. Levinas explains that this ontological meaning of habitation expresses the dynamic that takes place in the home through the inhabitant's freedom of movement. Mead makes the social dimension of human experience explicit through a definition of self that necessarily implies a relational dimension. He thus assumes that the individual's self does not exist but through its involvement in a social process. The self-consciousness is defined by Mead as the capacity to be an object for oneself and expresses the idea that there are possible distinctions within the individual's self. This is reflected in the propensity to maintain an attitude towards inanimate physical objects that is comparable to our attitude towards other beings. The affection we develop for objects and spaces, such as the one in which we live, is a social attitude towards what surrounds us. For Boulnow, the polarity that characterizes anthropological space positions the home as a center around which the vast world unfolds. He describes the dwelling place in relation to what lies outside it. As a center, it is a fixed point, a zero point, from which the envisaged space according to a polarity that allows complementarity movements, such as leaving and then returning to one's place of attachment. Boulnow defends the existence of a balance of tensions between the outside world and the centric tranquility of the protected home. Various components of the home contribute to this, such as the window, which, as the eye of the house, allows us to observe the outside world without being seen. The philosopher Hannah Arendt explains the conceptual distinction between private and public, drawing on elements of social history. She shows that the political organization of ancient Greece is the opposite of a natural grouping whose center is the home and the family. In this sense, property is a concrete place in the world that brings together private possessions. These possessions are those which, when used and consumed, are more necessary to life than anything that belongs to the common world. The private place is then a refuge for the individual who wants to extract himself from the world shared with others. To conclude this theoretical framework, we return to the organization of domestic architecture, where a distinction between more public and more private domains also exists according to a logical social stratification. Goffman uses the notion of scenic arrangement to explain this system that assumes the implementation of predefined social practices. The anterior regions are open to the gaze of spectators and provide a facade for observers. In the home, these are the places most easily accessible to visitors. They feature symbolic equipment in the form of furniture, decoration, and the arrangement of objects. The back areas are the hidden regions of the theatrical performance, the backstage areas. In the domestic sphere, these include the bathroom and bedroom, and sometimes the kitchen, from which the most public interactions can be excluded. The anterior region is thus defined as the place where the performance is given, while the posterior region is the place where the routine is prepared. It is also a protected place where extract oneself from the social role. This leads us to the formulation of a typology of thresholds that form a dispositive of the intimate, articulating social and spatial registers within the system of domestic architecture. The 8 types we work with are the advance, the projection, the doorstep, the reception, the entrance, the passage, the crosspiece, and finally, the private access. These threshold types are identified according to their positioning in the space system and their social role. These zones are openings between areas characterized by distinct type of sociality and are expressed as a marked break in the spatial sequence. These types are not exclusive, nor do they cover the entire spatial architectural vocabulary of the threshold. Rather, they serve as a taxonomy of the social spatial categories of the domestic thresholds. Let's look at how these types are defined and how cases from pre-modern and modern Western architecture illustrate them. Type 1, the advance. This type of threshold is defined as the zone that connects the public space to the space in direct proximity to the doorstep. It constitutes an extensional spatialization serving the inhabitants' representation and preparing for entry into the sheltered space. The inner courtyard through which visitors enter the glass house by Pierre Charot is an example of this type of space. It is reproducing the ceremonial courtyard that plays a symbolic role in the entrance to the residence, allowing visitors to admire the facade before entering. The advance towards falling water by right offers a unique threshold experience that heralds the symbiotic relationship between nature and the home. It begins long before the house is discovered, with a walk through the woods. The house gradually comes into view from a distance, staged in a setting of rocks and vegetation from which it emerged. It is thus impossible to determine when direct experience with the house begins, since it is inseparable from its context. Georges Perec describes with justness this experience in a text from the book Espèces d'espace. Type 2, the projection. The definition of this type is based on the intentional projection or expression of interior space towards exterior space. This projected threshold has also the particularity of taking the form of a character located within the domestic space or a surface such as the facade that exposes the status and values of the inhabitant. It is having a visual or ideal presence without the possibility of physical crossing. The glass brick wall of the main facade of the glass house presents itself as a screen, intentionally proposing a representation of its inhabitants. However, its materiality both protects and projects the building's internal space. It offers a projection surface for internal activities when night falls. The contrast expressed by the interior and exterior presentation of residences designed by Adolf Loos constitutes another form of projected threshold. It exposes a discourse on boundary between the uncluttered facade presented to public space and the enveloping richness of interior areas, as exemplified by the Villa Müller. Type 3, the doorstep. This is the emblematic threshold of the home. It carries the significance of the boundary between public space, usually exterior, and private space of the dwelling. It is characterized by an exterior spatial position projecting towards the built-up boundary of domestic space. Villa Merea by Alto is a remarkable example of a doorstep zone that emphasizes the boundary. The porch area combines several features that distinguish this threshold. This sheltered space, no longer quite outside but not yet inside, set up a confrontation with the newcomer, announces the character of the house and inhabitants, and marks the advance towards the living area. Tempe Paya by Eileen Gray provides another example of threshold that marks the limit between outside and inside, extending the doorway as a built boundary. The visitor first climbs the outside staircase from the road to reach the footbridge, which leads to the outside terrace, a kind of open-air living room. The route from the road to the terrace is itself a threshold zone, which takes place in sequence. Type 4, the reception. This threshold has been defined as the first zone entirely within the domestic space, where visitors are hosted and invited to enter further, and where others are stopped in their tracks. In the reception of Tempe Paya, Gray further exploits the sequence of spaces. The visitor's path is diverted to the left and sloped by steps leading down to the living room. In Villa Merea, the reception space is large enough to accommodate several people. 4 stairs position this area below the surrounding spaces. A low wall, curved towards the vestibule and lined with bamboo stalk forming a screen, partially obscures the view of the incoming visitor. The tiled floor and uniform ceiling helps to differentiate this area from the others around it. Type 5, the entrance. The entrance is located between 2 areas that are distinguished by their vocation to welcome and to receive in a chosen sociality. It is presenting itself as a room intended for occupation or as a space of circulation. Its function is to serve other rooms. The staircase linking the first floor to the living room in the glass house exemplifies this type. The reason for this entrance is the dual purpose of this house, which is both a residence and a medical clinic. It starts between the access to the interior of the building, the residential second floor, and the medical clinic. A sliding metal door restricts access to the living areas to direct patients to the professional premises. Type 6, the passage. This type is defined as the transit zone between reception rooms and entrenchment rooms. It serves to distance these regions and protect the possibility of the inhabitants' entrenchment. In the glass house, the staircase to upper floor, the mezzanine corridor, and the thick storage wall through which the bedrooms are accessed are examples. The transition here can be described as a gradual distancing via the staircase, visual contact on the mezzanine, and then a perceptible withdrawal into the bedrooms. The staircase leading to the first floor of Villa Merea, mainly intended for bedrooms and bathrooms, is another example of this type. It continues to mark the boundary between inside and outside through the bamboo screens that frame the ascent. This configuration expresses a progression towards the possible entrenchment of the upper floor. Type 7, the crosspiece. This type is a zone that provides privileged access between entrenched areas. It facilitates protected movement within private areas without having to pass through reception rooms or transit spaces shared by potential visitors. In the glass house, the retractable staircase between the bedroom and the boudoir, where Mrs. d'Alsace receives close visitors, offers an example of this type. Here, the 2 rooms are regions of restricted sociality, but the staircase is even more private, since those who use it must be admitted in the 2 rooms it connects. The use of this type of threshold, whose vocation is to provide an alternative route, also implies that there is habitually a main access to each of the 2 rooms it connects. This threshold opens onto secondary accesses, a sort of hidden passageway intended for the exclusive use of the inhabitants. Type 8, the private access. This threshold is characterized by the mediation it performs between interior rooms associated with restricted sociality and a protected exterior space. The private access turns an outdoor space into a zone belonging to the interiority of the home. It may provide a passageway to the rear courtyard. It can also take the form of a threshold with no passageway, revealing only a view of the outside space. It has 2 vocations, which can be distinct or combined, contemplative and utilitarian. The glass wall of the Villa Merea is an example of the private access for contemplating nature, which also provides access to the courtyard. In this case, the physical boundary between inside and outside is abolished, not to project the interior outwards, but to make the surrounding nature a work of art that integrates the living room. The glass wall fluidifies the movement between inside and outside, an impression that is reinforced by the possibility of sliding the glass door, which thus disappears and completely opens the room to the open air. In the glass house, the fenestration in the rooms, bedroom and boudoir positioned towards the rear courtyard, presents a contemplative rear access. This wall can be seen as a threshold without passage, for outdoor doors provide access to the terrace. Sequenced according to a thoughtful ordinance, these thresholds set up a social regulation established and accepted by convention. In addition, this regulation takes its importance by the concept of control attached to it. The order of the types between outside and inside favors regulation of the relationship with others and with oneself by transcribing the spectrum of the intimate in the spatial system. It also emerged that this dispositive operates in a dialectical tension set up by the threshold system. From the exteriority, we enter the route that is addressed to the arrival, while the threshold system becomes a communication canal and indicates the degree of penetration authorized in the space. In the opposite direction, from the interiority, the typical course belongs to the inhabitant. The space system then contains the potential of a right-of-way. In this context, the number and type of threshold become a measure of distancing and freedom capabilities. It is referring to the dialectical of the social foundation of the home formulated by Levinas through the notions of interiority and exteriority. The cases presented themselves as the architectural traces of a form of sociality that favors the intimate in the domestic space. They contain memory of the Western way of life that took shape in the 20th century in the sequence of social mutations that characterized the end of the previous century. As a legacy, the vocabulary and rich architectural syntax that these thresholds give us to appreciate is worth recording, preserving, and enhancing for the benefit of the quality of the built environment to be designed.